Hi, my name is Ben Atkinson, and welcome to Season 3 of the Functional Health Podcast. I'm trained in both biomedical science and nutrition, and I firmly believe that a holistic and functional approach to health is fundamental to our well-being. I interview some of the leading voices in nutrition and lifestyle medicine, from practitioners to professors and everyone in between. With this podcast, I will share with you their stories, their expertise, and their advice, shedding light on the industry from each of their perspectives and providing you with simple tips and tricks to help improve your health from today. This week, I'm delighted to share with you my conversation with Kimberly Wilson. Kimberly is a chartered psychologist and visiting lecturer working in a private practice in London. She uses a whole-body mental health approach to help improve a patient's health from all angles. Today, we are going to talk about nutritional psychiatry. I hope you enjoy it. So, without further ado, Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Thank you very, very much for having me.
So, Kimberly, you are a chartered psychologist with a philosophy of whole-body mental health. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So my basic tenet, my basic foundation is that we need to get away from this dualism, the separation of the mind from the body, of the brain from the body. And in large part, psychiatry and psychology are the main guilty party for that. For a very, very long time, we've kind of looked at the brain as completely distinct from the body. And therefore, anything that kind of goes wrong in the brain, whether that's psychiatric illness or neurodegenerative diseases, is treated only in brain-targeted treatments, whether that's talking therapy or psychotropic medications. And what that's kind of done is really relegated the body to just this meat suit that carries your brain around, but doesn't really have any intrinsic worth. And we know now there is a wealth of research that says that's just not true. And what happens in the body, of course, has a profound effect on what happens in the mind. And so I don't think you can get a full and comprehensive treatment of the mind, whether that's something like depression or something like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, without fully looking at what's happening in the body at the same time.
Fantastic. And I think although the evidence is certainly mounting, not many people maybe realize that what they eat and how they are living might be influencing how they feel. So when did your shift, or when did you shift to thinking this way?
Well, actually, for me, it coincided with my original training. So I did my undergrad in psychology, and then I did a 4-year postgrad in counselling psychology. And at the same time, as I was just qualifying, the first research in nutritional psychiatry was really coming out. So the first studies that demonstrated a relationship, and at that time it was just a correlation, but they were demonstrating a relationship between diet quality and risk of depression in women. And as a psychologist, depression really is, it's almost the bread and butter of what psychologists do. Depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. So we spend a lot of time in training looking at the causes of depression, the theoretical philosophies of what causes depression, whether you're thinking about early trauma or stress or lifestyle factors. And so it's something that's obviously right at the forefront of a psychologist's mind. But also at that same time, I did some of my first placements and my first professional roles in prisons. And there was some research that was done in the UK and then at the same time replicated in I think in the Netherlands, which showed in RCT, so these were randomized controlled trials, there was a control placebo group and an active group, which took male prisoners and gave them micronutrient supplementation, so vitamins, minerals, and omega-3s. And they found across both of these studies that there was a 30% reduction in violence and aggression.
Wow.
And right. And when you work in prisons, one of the biggest risk factors, one of the biggest issues in terms of security is self-harm and violence. So people cutting themselves or harming themselves, head-banging, or people getting into fights. And that's one of the most expensive parts of running a prison. And it's obviously one of the riskiest parts in terms of the clinical and medical care. of offenders. And so I was reading this research. I was running a therapy service in what was then Europe's largest women's prison. And although women only make up a very, very small part of the prison estate in the UK, so I think at the time, I can't even remember the numbers, but it's kind of less than 5% of all prisoners were women. They make up over half of the self-harm cases. So women self-harm in prisons at a rate which is astronomically higher than men do. And so these issues of aggression, self-harm, violence were really pertinent. And I was really thinking, well, if we've got this research, if we've got RCT, which is considered the gold standard for clinical research, why are we not implementing it? And the nutrition and the food in prisons, at least at that time, was pretty atrocious. And so I thought, if we've got this research, why are we not, supporting our clients, our offenders in terms of rehabilitation, but also making things safer for the staff and for the public when people are eventually released back into the community? But nothing came of it. I would ask these questions and nothing would come of it. And then I left prison. I stopped working in prisons, and I decided, well, fine. If I can't do anything there, I can at least take this I could take this information and integrate it into my treatment. So at least my clients can have the benefit of this research, which is very compelling. It's very, very robust, but for some reason isn't, well, it is now, but it certainly at that time wasn't really trickling down into patient care.
Because it seems like a relatively cheap and simple intervention to have such a profound effect.
This is the really extraordinary thing. And Julia Rutledge, she's out in New Zealand, has done so much work on the use of micronutrient supplementation in managing stress, in recovery from disasters. And I spoke to her. There was a recent conference on nutritional psychiatry here, and she was the final plenary speaker. And we spoke afterwards, and we spoke about the offender supplementation research. And she was saying she wanted to do something similar. And she was told, and she said, I could quote her on this, she said that she was told it was too dangerous to do that kind of research, just because of the legal and social justice implications. So it's a really... and I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but you can understand how it would be very, very inconvenient in terms of legal proceedings if people were getting off of their criminal charges with claims of malnutrition. But if we're thinking globally about reducing things like violence, like offending, then maybe we need to start thinking a bit earlier down the line, down the trajectory, about how we can have a much more integrated social approach to these issues.
So what are the key things there? Because it's like the vitamins and minerals which are implicated in maybe people being more violent. Are there certain deficiencies which you see quite often which are linked to this, or is it a little bit more ambiguous?
It is a little bit more ambiguous, and there's still lots of research that needs to be done. And the things that lead to, if we're talking about offending in particular, there's a very, very long and complex trajectory for someone to end up in prison. And for example, the biggest risk factor for someone ending up in prison is having had a parent go to prison while they were a child. So, there's a big part of this which is social factors, and that will include poverty, it will include food insecurity, it will include socioeconomic status, education, whether someone has been excluded from school or whether they've had to go to a special school because they were unable to be in mainstream school. All of these factors play a role. But, if we understand that nutrition is crucial for brain development, and that the brain continues to develop until, at least the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is continuing to develop into your mid-20s, then we should be thinking that nutrition is really important across this entire stage. And if there are a group of people who, as well as having very difficult and adverse life experiences, are not getting the right nutrients for healthy brain development, then I think that's a bigger social issue, and that's something that needs to be thought about. One of the other correlations with prisons in particular is that there is a very, very, very high incidence of psychiatric illness and offending. So somewhere in the region of 75% of people in prisons have at least 2 diagnosable mental health conditions. And one of the things that turns up quite a lot, for example, in first episode psychosis, are deficiencies in certain micronutrients, zinc, magnesium, and particularly the omega-3 fatty acids. So at the moment, those are correlations, and there's lots of work still being done across the world in different populations on whether micronutrient supplementation can help reduce risk, or whether if you can use it in first episode, it can reduce your risk of ending up with a severe mental illness. So that's still happening. But yeah, you're absolutely right that these are very cheap interventions. They're certainly much cheaper than prison. They're certainly much cheaper than, social work and probation and all of these things. And it's early intervention work. And I think if you could, one of my kind of fantasies is if we could put that case across to, the MOJ or the criminal justice system, then maybe we could start to get some ministers on board with this idea, and maybe we could start affecting policy, because policy is really where the changes are going to come.
Yes. And just to add to what you were saying before, I remember reading a case study, and it's only a case study, but this was a few years back, and it was about a woman who tried electroconvulsive therapy. I think she was manic depressive, and this kind of spiraled into, she had multiple different psychiatric disorders, and she became catatonic. And she had a vitamin B12 injection. She was found to be, they couldn't monitor how much B12 she had in her body because it was so low. And she came out of this kind of catatonic state through a vitamin B12 injection. And she had vastly reduced symptoms, and it was absolutely unbelievable. So what you're saying isn't new to me, but I think it's profound. I wasn't aware of the prison data either.
Yeah, I can send you the links. It's really fascinating work.
Yeah, I would love to read it. One thing that you mentioned at the start of the conversation was the link. You said that depression causes disability, or is one of the leading causes of disability. What do you mean by that? Because people might be thinking disabled, is that mobility or? Sure.
So in terms of the kind of World Health Organization definition, it's the amount of time and the amount of quality of the amount of quality of life that's lost to the illness. So the amount of time people spend off work, or the loss of quality time spent with their children or their families or in relationships, the loss of satisfaction through other daily activities, the associated somatic issues. So often depression is associated with physical pain and physical disabilities, migraines, headache, backaches, chronic pain. Obviously, not all of these things are always caused by depression, but there's a very high comorbidity. And that we do know that sometimes stress and depression are expressed through the body in somatic complaints. So globally, across the world, when we add it all together, people are suffering more in terms of this everyday loss of function from depression than they are, for example, from other disorders like heart disease, diabetes, cancer.
That is absolutely incredible. And I imagine a lot of people, including myself, weren't aware of that statistic. In your practice, do you find that nutrient deficiencies or eating habits exacerbate issues related to mental health?
Yes, it's slightly anecdotal, because although I have the option to offer blood tests through an associated clinic, most people, when you look at their food diary, you don't need to, you can assume. So some people will come in, and I had one person, for example, who in 2 days had only eaten 2 chocolate muffins, and they were quite severely depressed. And we thought, irrespective of what else is happening, this is not going to help.
Yes.
And so it's really about helping people understand that fundamentally your brain is an organ, and like your heart is an organ and it needs proper nutrition to function properly, your brain needs proper nutrition to function properly. And it's just kind of putting it on a par with other organs in the body, but also to understand that your brain is the most important organ in your body. And therefore we should be thinking much more about what happens when the organ that's responsible for personality, for mood, for decision making, for rational thoughts, for morality, isn't functioning properly. Then what we can expect is that we will get impairments in those factors. And so it's really just trying to kind of make that clear. Like, if you're not providing your brain with what it needs to do all of these things, it's not going to be able to do these things properly.
I suppose when you break it down that way, it makes perfect sense.
It's just common sense, right?
Yeah. One thing which I wanted to touch upon is like the prevalence of these conditions, mental health conditions in general, but also depression and anxiety. They seem to be rising, or certainly people are speaking about them much more than ever. Have you identified key contributors to this that maybe come up quite a lot in clinic or in general?
Well, this is kind of the billion-dollar question, right? Because we've had effective, in inverted commas, treatments since 1950s, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first antidepressants were developed in the 1950s, and if we've had effective treatments for 60, 70 years, why are the rates of illness increasing? And this is what's caused a real rethink in the way that we think about depression and its causes. So the main hypothesis is a serotonin hypothesis, and it says, well, you're depressed because of an imbalance in the amount of serotonin in your brain. It disappears too quickly, or there isn't enough being produced, and therefore, if we can get enough serotonin sloshing around, then your mood will improve. The issue with that is that the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor medications, which are supposed to increase the amount of available serotonin in the brain, only work for about a third of people. And sometimes, even for those people, not much better than placebo. So our most effective medications aren't working as well as we need them to be. And we're still getting rising rates of depression diagnoses, and we're getting rising rates of treatment-resistant depression. So depression that isn't affected by 3, 4, 5 different medications. And so the rethink has really been at looking at the idea of systemic and neuroinflammation in the body, and how that might be one of the kind of biological drivers of depression. And this seems to be the hypothesis that has a much better predictive quality. So you can look at it and say, well, if that's the case, we would predict that if we can bring down inflammation, if we can shift this biological feature, then we will get a reduction in depression. And that seems to be what's happening. And so to kind of come back to your question, it seems to be that there are more drivers in our daily lifestyles of this kind of immune response, this inflammation. And it's when this gets out of whack that the kind of very delicate tissue and function of the brain gets affected, and that comes out as depressive symptoms. Does that all make sense? I feel like I was talking for ages.
No, absolutely not. I think that makes perfect sense. The crux of it is the inflammation is a more predictive indicator of whether someone may develop depression, and indeed if they are depressed, then the chemical imbalance, which I think was the original hypothesis.
Yeah, and interestingly, with the inflammatory hypothesis, the new developing hypothesis, actually predicts, it can explain the serotonin hypothesis. So what we know, for example, is when your body is in this state of chronic inflammation, then the precursors, tell me if I'm getting too technical, but the precursors to serotonin, so serotonin, your happy hormone, is produced through the synthesis of tryptophan. And tryptophan is an amino acid, it's an essential amino acid that we get from food. But when your body is in a state of inflammation, that tryptophan is kind of rerouted. It's taken away from the production of serotonin, and it's shunted into a pathway for the production of a compound called kynurenine, or kynurenic acid. And kynurenine is neurotoxic. It's not good for your brain. And so you get two factors. So when you're in a state of chronic inflammation, you get two things that happen. First of all, you don't have enough tryptophan to produce serotonin. So there's less serotonin availability in the first place. So you have lower serotonin production. But secondly, you now have this additional insult of kynurenine. So as well as having less serotonin, your brain is now having to deal with kynurenine. And so that gives us a much clearer understanding of what might be happening in the brain of depression in that subset of patients who might be also affected by inflammation, because we're not clear at the moment whether it's everyone. Again, it seems to be about a third of people where inflammation is strongly implicated, and that it might be a lesser factor for other people, but the research is still kind of ongoing there.
Just from what you were saying before, just linking it back to what you've just said, the inflammatory hypothesis, it would also explain why the introduction of omega-3s in those prison studies would work, because omega-3s increase those those special molecules in the brain, prostaglandins type 1 and 3, which are anti-inflammatory. So yeah, it seems to all fit in quite nicely.
It gives us a very nice model, yeah.
So, like, in terms of interventions, and I realise everyone's an individual, and I don't like asking this question too much, but are there common ones which you see? Is everyone got too many omega-6s in their diet and too little omega-3s, and therefore an easy intervention would be increasing the intake of omega-3s in someone's diet to kind of dampen the inflammation? Is there an intervention which you use quite commonly?
So always to be very cautious and to kind of stick with what the research says. And what the research, I think, is really indicating is the role of the gut microbiome. I'm a big fan of omega-3s generally, just because those fatty acids, particularly DHA, form the cellular membrane of your brain cells, and you can only get them from food sources. So if you're not taking them in through food, and most people aren't eating their 1 or 2 portions of oily fish a week, so most people's brains are probably a little bit depleted. So I'm always a fan of, people thinking about increasing their intake of oily fish, or perhaps considering supplementation. But the other factor, and I think probably what's going to be, I think my prediction is that we're going to see much, much more that the health of the brain is associated with the health of the gut. And that's because so much of our immune function and so much of what leads or mitigates this experience of chronic inflammation happens in and around the gut. And so if your gut microbiome isn't happy, then I think that's going to be one of the major issues in terms of monitoring health. So in that sense, it would be fiber, omega-3s and polyphenols. So making sure that people are getting their 30 grams of fiber every day. And most people are really woefully short on that. Most people aren't eating beans and legumes 3 or 4 times a week. They're mostly not eating whole grains, starchy vegetables, the alliums, garlic, onions, leeks. And so actually it might be something, and I spoke to Professor John Cryan about this, and he's one of the leaders in gut microbiome research, and it might simply be that in the future we're able to give targeted prebiotics, so targeted fibers, to help with psychiatric diagnoses. So I usually try to encourage the people for whom it's relevant to think about fiber, as well as, all of the other stuff that you hear every day of the week: oily fish, fruits and vegetables, plenty of water, and keep down, try to reduce things like excess alcohol, excess free sugars, stuff like that.
People might be listening and thinking, hang on, are you saying my digestive system can be linked to my mental health and the way I feel?
Right.
Is there an example where I guess you could link that? I guess when people are nervous just before an exam, quite often they run into the bathroom, but that's the head influencing the gut, right? Also the way you think influence your digestion.
Yes. Well, the link goes both directions. And so, and the link, the relationship is both direct and indirect, right? So the direct link is the vagus nerve. So this long wandering nerve that starts at the kind of base of your brain, goes throughout the body. So it loops in under your throat and towards the ears, goes down through the back of the neck, connects into the lungs, the heart, the liver, the spleen, the stomach, and finishes down in the gut. And so if you think about this nerve as a motorway with 10 lanes, actually 7 or 8 of those lanes are going upwards from the gut to the brain. So the brain is always receiving information from the body of what's happening in the body, and in particular the gut. there's lots of really, really intriguing research now, for example, about the idea that some quite serious neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis might actually originate in the gut through this vagus nerve connection. So it might start as, something like a molecule that's associated with BSE, either its metabolites or the molecule itself traveling through this nerve, getting into the brain where it shouldn't be, sparking inflammation and starting that disease. And that research is still at the moment in preclinical stage.
Mm-hmm.
And observational data, but it's very, very compelling. So people, for example, who have had their vagus nerve cut have lower rates of Parkinson's disease, for example. So, we have some speculative information around that. Some of the other slightly more convincing stuff is around the RCTs that have shown that when you improve diet, so trials like Healthy Med and the SMILES trial, that when you improve diet, you get a reduction and sometimes a remission in depression in people who already had a diagnosis of depression and whom were already on treatment. And that's linked to things, for example, like possibly, so in the SMILES, for example, they didn't test inflammation. But what we know the gut microbiome can do is to reduce compounds like serotonin, vitamins, short-chain fatty acids that can travel to the brain in the bloodstream, or communicate with the brain through the vagus nerve, or affect the immune system. So lots of different ways, and that all of these mechanisms can affect the health of the brain. And as I say that, I know that I've spoken to colleagues who find all of this very, very difficult, and that's because we're so steeped in the idea that the brain and body is separate. But what I just invite people to do is just stick with the research, stay close to the RCTs, read the research, and try to get away from the idea that your brain is just this kind of separate brain in a jar that's unaffected by what's happening in the body. That just doesn't make sense.
Just going back to what you were saying before, the idea of diet affecting the brain, you spoke about certain fibers affecting certain bacteria, which in the gut, which make up our microbiome, which can affect the way we feel. And even though there's preliminary evidence, the idea that certain diets can have benefit, that by very definition, these would have a range of different polyphenols and antioxidants from food, as well as prebiotics. So you would imagine that would influence the gut anyway. But what about probiotics? This is something which comes up quite a lot. And you've got, I'm not sure it's a fad, but people are becoming more aware of kind of kombucha, your kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi. Do they have merit in this field?
So the research on probiotic foods is still kind of out. The most researched one is kefir. And it seems, yes, maybe, possibly, it probably doesn't harm you. And the issue actually sometimes with sauerkraut is that it is quite salty. So that has separate implications. But the general consensus with probiotics, whether it's probiotic foods or supplementations, is that it's almost like if your gut is like this village and a carnival comes through town, or tourists come through town and they spend their money, that they don't stick around, but the village benefits from their presence as they pass through town. So they don't stick around, they don't stay and set up their own businesses, but they can have a positive effect as they move through. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like probiotics are going to be any good for people who are already healthy. They might be beneficial for people who have, who are already unwell, particularly in IBS. It seems that it might be beneficial there. And again, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is a disorder which is very, very comorbid with depression and anxiety. So possibly probiotics for IBS. John Cryan and Ted Dinan and his team are still working on, understanding perhaps which types of probiotics might be good for particular issues. I think there was some work that came out of Australia that showed that if you gave mothers a probiotic supplement during the last, I think it's the last 6 months of pregnancy and the first 6 months after childbirth, they had a reduced risk of postnatal depression, which was fascinating. I think I've got that on my Instagram somewhere.
I can link to that for everyone in the show notes.
So that stuff is still ongoing. So as yet, I guess it's for most people, we don't know. If you enjoy the taste of probiotic foods, then go for it. If you don't eat anything that you don't like. That's just silly. Um, and actually, again, probiotics don't make sense. Filling yourself up with these live bacteria doesn't make sense unless they've got something to eat. So it's really, again, about focusing on fiber and making sure you've got a good range of varied fibers in your diet on a regular basis.
I would just wanted to go back. The probiotics, when you say that mothers were giving it a probiotic, now I understand that probiotics within foods, although they may not populate the gut or populate the gut microbiome, as you said, they don't stick around, even though they've got benefits. They have like a range of different bacteria within them, various different strains. In probiotic formulas, they're normally very limited. And I know you can buy just one strain of a probiotic. Was that particular study, or are studies in general looking at one specific bacteria and how it benefits? Or
it's a bit of both. So often, so again, these are clinical dose ones. So these aren't supplements that people are buying off the shelf in their local health food store. These are clinical grade with billions and billions of colony forming units. So that's the first thing to say. These aren't available for consumers. And I think there's a mixture. So some people are doing kind of multi-strain probiotics. One of the strains, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, seems to have the best research in terms, I think, of managing anxiety. And there are some consumer products that do contain it. I think, what's the liquid one? Simprove contains rhamnosus. Other probiotics are available. But I don't know if that. I haven't checked how much the ones that are available in that kind of product compare to the amounts that were given in the clinical trial. So again, the jury's still out. The research still needs to be done. And I think it would be prudent, again, to making sure you're eating plenty of fiber-rich foods and then just waiting for the research to be completed.
Yes, and I think what's empowering is that even though we might not be able to have access to these bacteria, which are trialed in studies right now, but the fact that we can influence our own gut microbiome just through the foods that we eat, through fibers, like you said, the range of different foods, multiple different colours of vegetables and fruits, for the polyphenols, and then maybe taking probiotics for those people who are experiencing anxiety or depression might be beneficial.
Might be, yeah. And actually, one of the interesting things, so it just reminded me about kefir, is that it's probably the food with the most abundant diversity of microbiome strains. So where, for example, your average yogurt has maybe 3 or 4 different strains of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, and maybe even the new kind of kefir yogurts or the consumer ones have 12 or 13. A homebrew kefir, where you make it yourself with kefir grains, has over 40 different strains. So if you're eating that on a regular basis, that's going to be helping to add to that gut microbiome diversity. And what we know as yet, we don't know a huge amount, but what we know as yet, or what we believe as yet, is that diversity is what's associated with good health.
Yes, right, fantastic. And when you said kefir, because there's so many different ones out on the market now, it's not just dairy, it's coconut, there's water, there's etc. What is the research? What is the research telling us is the most beneficial? Is it the milk or?
So the milk is the most well researched, and the non-dairy kefirs they're very new to the market. So I don't think much research has been done at them at the moment. So I don't know as yet whether they are as abundant. Maybe they have higher diversity, but the homebrew dairy kefir is the one that's got the most research at the moment. And that seems to be, sorry.
No, absolutely fine. I actually used to, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I'm going to. I actually used to ferment, I used to make kefir, like it was goat milk kefir. I used to buy raw goat milk and ferment it on the counter whilst I was at university. And people would just be like, what are you doing? Because when you make kefir, it like separates, right? So you can see like a clear liquid because the lactic acid it creates as well as the milk on the top. And it just looks horrendous. It does. But it's apparently very good for you. So
Yeah, no, I brew. I've got a fermentation station, but basically I've got it all going on. So I've got kombucha, sauerkraut, kefir, and water kefir. So dairy and water kefir.
Oh, I'm jealous.
And if you catch me on a good day, I'll be making some kimchi as well. So yeah, I try to kind of practice what I preach and stick, as I say, stick to where I think the research is, and just making sure that there's plenty of diversity in what I eat.
Yeah, I think that's the best way forward for sure.
Mm.
So, hang on, I've lost the spot. Kind of went off in so many tangents, and I've made so many arrows on the bit of paper that I'm writing on that I can't quite keep track. So we've talked about things which can benefit your gut. Now I'm going to mention the dreaded word for some people, and that is gluten. So gluten and wheat seem to be one of those controversial topics where people say it causes a lot of harm. It harms their mental health. They don't feel good after they eat it. And quite often, and this is anecdotal, but quite often my friends maybe experience like a gut issue, and then they experience maybe a cognitive issue. Now, I don't know whether it's the pain which is causing the issue in terms of cognition and mental health, or whether they're inexplicably linked. I was wondering what your thoughts are on it, because I know it's a controversial topic.
Yeah, like how long have you got, Fran?
I know, I should have started the conversation with this, really.
All right. So now what's really interesting about the gluten conversation is, well, it's super complex. So I think the first thing to say is the general overriding common sense comment is, because you sometimes hear that gluten is terrible for every gut, it's abrasive for everyone. And I would like to say, if that were true, then the nation of Italy wouldn't exist, right? The high gluten consuming nations wouldn't exist, or they'd have these astronomically high levels of psychiatric illness, and they just don't. So we'll put that out to a kind of common sense test, and then kind of get down into the details. So below that is the issue of gluten sensitivity, and there are lots and lots of studies that have demonstrated now that more people think they are sensitive to gluten than actually are. And that actually what happens is that a lot of the rhetoric, whether it's on social media, whether it's certain books or influencers who have told you that gluten is terrible for you and therefore bread is terrible for you and all of these other foods, actually creates what's called a nocebo effect, which is that you expect a negative reaction, and even when you're not presented with that food, you still get a negative reaction. So they gave a group of people who had self-diagnosed with gluten sensitivity a cereal bar. Half the people were told that, oh yes, it's gluten containing, and half were told that it wasn't. I think actually I'm confusing a couple of trials, but the cereal bar didn't have any gluten, but people still said that they got gut symptoms and they still experienced pain. And so that's the nocebo effect. That's you thinking that you're going to get a negative effect, and actually you get what you're looking for.
Right.
So there's the placebo and there's the nocebo effect. Below that, of course, there are people with actual issues with gluten. So celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And these are diagnosable, they are testable. And these people absolutely, celiac disease, when people with celiacs have gluten, there's damage to the gut, the villi kind of erode, they can't absorb nutrients, it's bad news. So absolutely, for those people, gluten is a real danger. What's really interesting in terms of mental health is that people with celiac disease do have a higher risk of psychiatric illness.
Right, okay.
And there are some case studies, I think, reaching back to the 1920s in terms of psychosis and what's called gluten or celiac psychosis. And I want to be really specific, and I want to kind of be really clear that I'm talking about a very, very, very small subset of the population. So we're talking about 1% of the population is at risk or develops schizophrenia, And then maybe the research is indicating that maybe 30% of that 1% does seem to be affected by gluten, that their psychiatric symptoms do seem to be affected by gluten, and that for these people, this very small subset of people, a reduction or an elimination of gluten from the diet can support their symptoms. Now, that is for diagnosis by, the clinical care team and specialist dietitians. But what it means is that most people are absolutely fine. And what we think happens with these people isn't just that, gluten hurts them, is that we think that they probably had some digestive illness early in life, which is then that coincides also with a risk factor. So they already have a genetic risk factor. Mm-hmm. Then they get an illness early in life that either damages or shifts the gut microbiome or triggers the immune system. And then it's this combination of genetic risk factor and environmental trigger that then makes these particular group of people susceptible to this response to gluten.
Yes.
So it's very, very specific. And, I'm pretty sure I eat gluten every single day. And I'm someone who obviously cares a lot about my brain, and I want to be making sure that I'm giving my brain the best it can. And I eat gluten most days of the week, gluten-containing foods. So, yeah, I'm saying maybe for a very tiny subset of people, but for most people, gluten is fine. And gluten-containing foods, if they're whole grain, so if we're thinking whole grain barley and whole grain wheat foods, are an important source of cereal fiber. And cereal fibers are associated with a good, strong diverse gut microbiome and better health.
Okay. If someone does have celiac, though, and they want to improve their gut microbiome, what kind of foods would they use to build their gut microbiome up if they can't take in these grains?
So you'd be looking at other sources of fiber, right? So, talk to your specialist dietitian, your celiac dietitian.
Yes.
But the other fruits, vegetables, legumes. But yeah, specialist dietitian will be able to advise people on that. I don't want to step on any toes.
Very well conserved answer there. One thing which came up before, and I got asked before I came on this podcast with you, is that anxiety can actually strike at any time for people who are susceptible to it. So what can we do in our daily lives to make sure that we have a greater resilience to anxiety?
Sure. So, the very therapist response is understanding really what anxiety is for that person and what the triggers are. So, for example, some people are just, I think, constitutionally more sensitive, and what one person might be resilient to, another person might have a more anxious response to. Sometimes also, I think it's worth saying, some people mislabel anxiety for just a normal, everyday kind of nervousness that you would expect. So if you're going up to kind of give a talk, I wouldn't call that anxiety in a clinical sense, but normal everyday nerves. So sometimes it's about helping people to just accept a normal level of nervousness and worry. But of course, some people do really, really struggle with anxiety, and some of the best kind of resilience or protective factors is exercise, actually. So getting regular physical activity is one of the most robust ways to help reduce your experience of anxiety. And again, people find that a little bit strange. Why should exercise help? But there are lots of different biological mechanisms that come out of exercise that can really help support the brain. But also the idea that essentially, again, your body is one integrated system. And so if you're building resilience in one system, it also affects another. So physical exercise, physical activity helps to build physiological resilience, but also your brain benefits from that. So not just physiologically in terms of, being able to tolerate more stress, because that's what exercise does for you. It helps you to improve your capacity to manage stress. But the other psychological traits, like kind of sticking with something, pushing through discomfort, tolerating a not very nice situation. So if you're in a difficult workout and you need to finish it, then there's the psychological mechanisms. And we think those things generalize psychologically to help people better manage anxiety as a response to exercise.
Very eloquently put.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So there's a few more questions.
Sure.
What is the most beneficial health change that you have made to your life, and why?
I don't know if I can name just one, because it's almost over the years, and so I've been looking at this stuff for 15 years now. It's been kind of incremental changes. Maybe being more consistent with exercise, possibly. So just before I came onto this call, I'd kind of run over to the gym, quickly got in, exactly a 30-minute workout, which is kind of the minimum that your brain likes. It's the dose that your brain likes, and came back in time for the call. And that's really because there's so much evidence around physical activity for protecting the brain, not just from things like depression, anxiety, but from the newest, biggest killer in the UK, which is Alzheimer's disease. And so I try to be, and I get, very, very busy, and sometimes I can't fit in as much movement as I would like, and my job is sedentary and all of that stuff. But even if it's just 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I do try to get a little bit of movement in as often as possible.
How do you think that holistic psychology, by the way that you practice it, can become more integrated into healthcare?
So I think that has to happen at a few levels. First of all, psychologists don't get, we talk about GPs and doctors not getting enough nutritional training. Psychologists don't get any, and we take a very, very theoretical approach, a philosophical approach to the brain. So I separately did my training in nutrition because I realized how crucial this was. And in my training, then focused on the nutrition for the brain, and particularly in relation to neurodegenerative disorders. So first of all, postgraduate trainings in psychology need to shift to include nutrition. And I don't know if health psychology does, maybe it does. But certainly clinical and counselling psychology need to get on board with the idea that the brain is an organ, and if our job is to help people protect their brains, which I think if you're talking about mental health, that's exactly what we're doing, then we need to at least have a working understanding of the impact of lifestyle factors on that: nutrition, movement, sleep, stress management, relationships. It's the reason that I developed a CPD course for psychologists called, things that psychologists should know about these lifestyle factors. So I think it has to come through the training, because then it will trickle down into frontline patient treatment. But I think it also needs to come higher up in terms of policy. So when a woman discovers that she's pregnant, when the family being told about how to protect and look after the child's mental health, when schools are thinking about protecting the children's mental health, because 70% of psychiatric disorders arrive by the age of 25. These happen in early life. We need to be thinking about how do we make sure that at a population level, people are getting what they need as much as possible to protect their mental and brain health. And that's a bigger question than just tooling up psychologists. That's perhaps a program of supplementation for the most at-risk families. It's perhaps breakfast clubs at schools where they give out a multivitamin. I don't know. These are kind of ideas off the top of my head, but it's thinking at a much broader community population level about how do we make sure that most children and adolescents are getting enough of the nutrients that help to protect their brains long term, and that this is a preventative long-term social strategy, so that as a nation, we're having less incidents of people becoming ill, because psychiatric and psychological diseases destroy lives. And if we're serious about reducing the risk, then we need to start intervening much, much earlier in the life trajectory.
And lastly, can you please give the listeners 3 tips, although I know you've given many already, to help improve their health and well-being from today?
Yes. So the first one, I guess, is probably the obvious one, which is around nutrition. So make sure you're getting your fiber, your omega-3s, and your polyphenols. So everything that I've mentioned already before, your oily fish, your brightly colored fruits and vegetables, your berries, and try to consume those as much as possible. There was a great study that showed that in older people who ate a serving, which is about a kind of salad bowl size, of leafy greens every day, in older age had brains that looked and behaved 11 years younger than their peers.
Wow.
So yeah, like it's a big deal. Eat your greens, kind of all that stuff that you were told to do when you were a kid. And I think, and I've mentioned exercise, but I think the other things that people really underestimate in terms of mental health is emotional care. So when we're looking at diagnosing someone's psychological illness or psychiatric disorder, so often what we're talking about is emotional health. Are they responding emotionally in an appropriate way? Are they laughing in the right places, or are they laughing in the wrong places? Are they chronically low in mood? Are they chronically anxious? So actually, your emotions are crucial to your mental health, but we have this very, very dismissive attitude to emotional health, and emotions are seen as soft touch and kind of surplus to requirements, and all that matters is the rational kind of um, hyper rational brain, and that's the only thing that we need to think about. So I always encourage people to just everyday emotional management. Check in with yourself. I very often suggest people do a 1 line a day diary, a little journal where they just check in. It's 1 line. It's less than a minute a day, and so that you just get into the habit of checking in with yourself, seeing how you feel, and that increased level of awareness will help you to recognize earlier when your mood starts to slip, and that will allow you to intervene earlier before you get to a chronic or severe stage of mental illness. And then linked to that, so my tip number 3 is relationships. So in spite of everything that I've said about nutrition and exercise and sleep or whatever, actually the biggest factors in people's life satisfaction and their well-being, and sometimes even their longevity, is the quality of their social relationships. And I think we can neglect those way too much in pursuit of success and ambition and being seen to be doing all the things all the time by everyone. And we can end up neglecting our friendships. And so I would really encourage people to, the same way that you schedule your workouts or your PT, to schedule your relationships. Make sure that you're getting a regular catch up with friends in person as much as possible, because that's the stuff that's really going to see you through.
So nutrition, journaling and laughter, and then building and maintaining and nurturing those relationships.
Yes.
Those are 3 wonderful tips. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So I've heard that you're writing a new book, or that you've just finished writing one, which includes...
Sorry, I'm very excited.
But it includes much more detailed information about exactly what we were just talking about, plus much more. Can you tell the listeners a little bit more about it?
Yes. In fact, this is the first time that I've kind of been asked. This is my first book interview. This is an exclusive. Yeah, sorry, I should be very serious. The publisher would be very upset. I'm kind of being very silly about it. No. It's called How to Build a Healthy Brain, and it's exactly this. So what I do is I go through what I call the major players, the 2 biggest factors in protecting your brain health long term. So it's not just about what can you do to improve your mood in the next week, but I really also want you to think about how can I reduce my risk of these growing health concerns like dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and basically just kind of MCI, so mild cognitive impairment. How do I reduce my risk of these diseases that are associated with aging, but actually aren't an inevitable part of aging? And that's one of the things I want to get across, that it's not just inevitable that as you get older, you become forgetful, you aren't as organized as you were before, that you can't keep people's names in mind. We shouldn't expect that as a normal consequence of aging, and that there are things that we can do that can reduce our risk. So in the book, I go through what I call the two major players that affect this. So neurogenesis, which is the creation and protection, the survival of new brain cells, and inflammation, so that process which seems, we think, to damage the brain, and all of the lifestyle factors, so all the ones that have good evidence that you can implement, most of them straight away, to help nudge things in your favor. So I go through all of that stuff. So sleep, nutrition, breathing is one of them. So activation of the vagus nerve and how that affects stress management, different types of movement. I've got a section on why yoga is actually one of the most comprehensive interventions you can use for your mental health, but also emotional management. So how do you understand and deal with big emotions that people struggle with, like anger and shame and envy? How do you improve your relationships? How do you protect the health of the next generation? I talk to policymakers, the whole shebang. So I really wanted to make a very, very comprehensive guide, a Bible almost, for how to protect your brain health throughout your life. And I'm really, really hoping that, you know, people start to get the idea that there are things you can do, preventative and protective strategies to look after your brain health. It's not just about physical health, you know, and in the same way that we do think, oh, okay, if I exercise, I can reduce my risk of heart disease. I want people to be thinking, oh, if I do these things, I can reduce my risk of these psychiatric illnesses as well.
Fantastic. Sounds like a wonderful, comprehensive book. So for everyone, I will link to that in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Kimberly, it's been a huge pleasure to have you on the show. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you about whole body approach to psychology. But before you go, can you please tell the listeners where they can find you and what projects you have coming up?
Sure thing. So I am food and psych pretty much everywhere. So it's FOODANDPSYCH on Instagram, which is where I do most of my stuff, to be honest. Twitter and Facebook. Facebook is pretty silent, so just come see me on Instagram. And I have a monthly book club where we look at the psychological themes of various books, which is live on Instagram once a month. And coming up, I guess mostly at the moment, I'm just focusing on the book, which is going to be published in March. So preparation for the book and also working on some workshops. So that training that I did for psychologists, I also do for the public. And I'm working on also some other workshops with a colleague of mine around relationships with food. So everything pretty much in that food and psychology bracket. I'm trying to help people to better understand and to have a better relationship with food for themselves, but also to help understand what's going on in their minds and protect their mental health as well.
Just to clarify, everything that we spoke about today, I'll put in the show notes and I'll link to Kimberly's book, website and social media. Kimberly, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I do hope that we can speak again soon.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Functional Health Podcast. You can find links to everything that we talked about today in the show notes. If you have a second, please consider leaving a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really does make a huge difference and helps get this valuable information out and reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date and know whenever I release a new episode. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, or our website, and all questions are welcome. As always, thanks to Joss Aurelia for the editing and Alan Harper for his support.